The first scream did not belong to a man. It tore across the forest in the hour before dawn, high and ragged, the kind of sound that made every living creature still its breath. Birds scattered from the treetops. The hounds tethered in the ranger camp whined and pressed against the earth as though to crawl beneath it. Even the river, broad and steady, seemed to hush its current. Captain Phamir raised his head from the map spread across his knees. He had heard cries before: wolves, orcs, dying horses, but this was something else, something stretched too far for a mortal throat. He rose without a word, the quiet authority of command radiating from him, and every man in the circle knew at once they would not be sleeping again that night. The company of rangers had camped in the ruins of an old watchtower, its stones blackened by fire long ago. Around the low flame sat Baronar, the seasoned warrior whose patience was both anchor and weapon, Yogar, the tall Rohir with sharp eyes and a horseman's restless posture, and Eogar, youngest of the three, quick with his spear and quicker with his tongue until fear silenced him. The scream came again, fainter now, but lingering in the bones like cold. "Not wolf," Yogar muttered, spitting into the dirt. His voice was rough as gravel. "Nor orc. Something that burns its voice to make that sound." Baronar's gaze moved to Phamir. He did not ask the question aloud. He had followed the captain long enough to know answers came only when Phamir was certain. Phamir closed the map, folded it once, and slipped it into his cloak. "It comes from the eastern wood," he said, eyes narrowing toward the horizon where the sky was paling. "We ride at first light." Before the others could reply, the air shifted. A figure approached the camp, moving between the shadows with a grace that marked her as no mortal traveler. She did not announce herself. The company rose to their feet instinctively, hands brushing hilts. When the firelight caught her, its glow seemed dim beside the pale shimmer of her presence. Narion of Lothlorien stepped into the ring of men. Her cloak trailed silver threads like moonlit water, her eyes reflecting the flame though she did not look at it. She inclined her head in silent greeting before speaking, her voice low and measured. "You heard it, then," she said. Phamir studied her, masking the sharp pull of memory. The elves did not wander so far south without reason. "You know what made that cry?" Narion's gaze shifted eastward. "Not a beast. Not holy. A man once. But no longer." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Even the hounds dared not stir. "He wears 2 rings," she said, each word precise, heavy. "The power tears him apart, yet he clings to it. His body burns with what he cannot contain, and in his agony the world shudders." Eogar swallowed, his voice small. A man with 1 ring would be terror enough. Baronar's joy tightened. 2 rings and still living? That is blasphemy. Narion's expression did not change, but her eyes shone with an old sorrow. "He is called Karanir. Once a scholar among men, curious beyond patience. He believed knowledge should bow to his will. Now the fire he grasped will not release him, and he will not release it." Phamir felt the name like a stone dropped into deep water. He had heard it once in the archives of Minas Tirith, a minor name, a footnote in dusty scrolls. Nothing that explained the horror twisting the forest tonight. "Why come to us?" Phamir asked. Narion turned to him, her voice quieter still. "Because the burden of choice is yours. Men walk closer to the earth than elves. Where we hesitate, you act." The shadow grows around him. "If no one answers, it will spread until the cries you heard tonight are drowned in thousands more." The words settled over the camp like frost. Phamir looked to his men. Baronar's steady eyes met his, offering no protest. Yogar's hand rested on his spear, fingers drumming restlessly, but his nod was firm. Eogar shivered and looked away, but he too would follow. Phamir drew a slow breath, tasting the weight of command. He thought of his father, the steward, who bore a city on his shoulders. He thought of the land, fields and streams that did not know the danger pressing toward them. He thought of the scream that had torn the night wide open. At last, he turned back to Narion. "Then we go east," he said. "Show us the path." The elf inclined her head, a shimmer of light in her hair like dawn breaking. Beyond the ruined watchtower the forest waited, patient and dark. The scream had ceased, but the silence it left behind was worse, as though the world itself held its breath. And so, before the sun had risen, the company of rangers and the lone elf set their course toward the place where a man's hunger had made him more and less than human. The shadow before dawn was only beginning. The company moved before the sun lifted its first line over the mountains. The earth was soft with dew, but the air smelled faintly of ash, as though a fire smoldered somewhere unseen. Their cloaks gathered the damp, their boots left only shallow imprints, and still they felt exposed. The scream from the night before had been swallowed by silence, but silence itself had teeth. Phamir led them with the steady calm his men trusted. His gaze never faltered from the tree line ahead, though the weight in his chest grew with each step. He thought of the map folded in his cloak, of routes and rivers, and the names of villages where children would still be sleeping. All of it seemed fragile now, one cry away from ruin. Behind him, Barona walked with the rhythm of a soldier who had learned long ago not to waste motion. He said little, but every so often Phamir caught him studying the forest with the keen patience of a man tallying threats. Yogar trailed slightly apart, eyes scanning the high branches as though expecting the scream's author to drop from them. Eogar kept close to the group, his hand never straying far from his spear, the bravado of youth burned away by the memory of the night's terror. And Narion, she moved as if she belonged to another world entirely. Her steps made no sound, her cloak carried its own faint shimmer, and yet her presence did not comfort the men. She was reminder and warning both, proof that what they followed was larger than their own courage. By mid-morning they reached a ridge that overlooked a clearing. The trees had been blackened in a perfect circle, trunks split as if by lightning. The ground was scarred, not with flame alone but with something stranger, grooves etched into the soil like script too ancient to be read. Eogar muttered a curse. "What is this?" Narion crouched at the edge of the circle, her hand hovering just above the charred soil. "Power that does not belong to him," she whispered. "The rings argue inside him. They claw for dominance, and the earth remembers their quarrel." Phamir stepped forward, his boots crunching on brittle ash. He imagined Karanir standing in the center of the circle, torn between two hungers, body shaking as the fire ripped out of him. He imagined the sound it must have made, the sound they had heard in the dark. "This is not a trail we follow," Barona said grimly. "This is a warning." "Then we heed it," Phamir answered. But the words tasted like iron. They pressed on, the forest darkening as clouds moved across the sun. Hours passed in uneasy. The huts were nothing more than frames of timber and stone, roofs collapsed, walls leaning as though tired of standing. No smoke, no voices. Only the smell of something left too long in the sun. Yogar dismounted and entered the nearest hut. He returned moments later, his face carved in hard lines. "Not orcs," he said quietly. "Not beasts. The people here burned from within. Their skin cracked like clay. I have seen men taken by fire, but not like this." Narion's eyes closed as if in mourning. "The rings cannot be borne by mortal flesh." The agony spreads. To be near him too long is to share his ruin. Eogar staggered back, clutching his spear as though it were a lifeline. "So just standing near him can kill us?" "Standing near him will test you," Narion said, her voice heavy with certainty. "He is not strong because of the rings. He is strong because he refuses to let them go. That refusal alone is poison." Phamir watched his men absorb the words. Fear had a way of hollowing loyalty if left unchecked, and he could not allow it to spread. He placed a hand on Eogar's shoulder, steady, grounding. "Then we do not stand near him," he said. "We strike, and we move before the poison takes root." The young ranger nodded, though his eyes still darted to the ruins as though expecting the dead to rise. They made camp at dusk in the shelter of a half-fallen tower, the Anduin glittering faintly beyond the trees. The fire was small, barely more than embers, but it felt like defiance against the creeping dark. Barona sat polishing his blade, his expression unreadable. Yogar scanned the shadows, muttering to himself in his own tongue. Eogar wrapped his cloak tight, shivering despite the warmth. Narion sat apart, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "The rings are calling to one another," she said softly, more to herself than the others. And now the crown will answer them if he finds it. Phamir turned his head. The crown. Her eyes met his, steady and grave. A relic older than your line, Captain. Forged to make harmony of what was never meant to be joined. If Karanir claims it, his agony will end, and the world will inherit it in his place. The fire popped, sending sparks into the night air. For the first time, Phamir felt the true shape of their journey. This was not only about a man destroying himself with greed. This was about what that greed might awaken. And though the forest was silent, Phamir felt the weight of unseen eyes watching from the dark, waiting for the moment when silence would break again. The ruins of Osgillth rose before them like broken teeth, the river curling black around shattered walls. Moonlight painted the stones pale, but the air felt warm, as though the ruins themselves still smoldered from an old fire. The company entered in silence, their footsteps echoing too loudly in the hollow streets. Phamir moved at the front, his hand brushing the hilt of his sword. He could feel the weight of Narion's words since the night before. If Karanir claims the crown, his agony will end, and the world will inherit it. That thought clung to him more fiercely than the damp river air. They descended into the bowels of the city, guided by Narion's memory of half-forgotten records. The tunnels smelled of damp stone and dust, the air heavy with the breath of things buried too long. At last, they reached a chamber sealed by an iron gate half-swallowed by rubble. Baronar and Yogar strained against the stones until the way groaned open. The sound rolled down the corridor like a drumbeat, announcing their intrusion to whatever still haunted these halls. Inside, the vault waited. It was not grand, only a round chamber, its ceiling half-collapsed, its walls carved with symbols that flickered in the torchlight. But at the center stood a pedestal of black marble, and upon it rested a coffer bound in silver bands. The metal shimmered faintly, though no torch touched it. Narion's breath caught. She stepped forward as if drawn, her fingers trembling. "The crown of the stars," she whispered. I feared it was legend. The others exchanged wary glances. To them it was only a box, but Phamir felt something more. The air thrummed, a subtle vibration in his chest, as though the chamber itself were a bell struck by invisible hands. "Careful," Baronar warned, his blade half-drawn. "Not everything that shines is meant for men." Phamir approached slowly. As his hands closed around the coffer, a note like a single string of music rose in the air, too soft to be heard by the ears, but deep enough to settle in the bones. The song was neither threat nor comfort. It was invitation. For a moment he swayed, his vision clouding. He saw fields of Gondor unburned, cities whole, the laughter of children carried on wind free of ash. He saw peace, simple and enduring, as if the crown itself promised it. Then the vision snapped away. He staggered, clutching the coffer to his chest. Narion's voice cut through the haze. "Do not listen too long. It does not lie, but it does not tell the whole." Before Phamir could answer, a new sound rose, not the crown song, but the clash of steel and the guttural roar of voices. Shadows poured into the chamber. Orcs, twisted men, things that had not been born but crafted. At their center walked a figure taller than the rest, skin cracked like dry clay, light leaking from the fissures. His eyes glowed with red fire. 2 rings gleamed on his hands, their light unnatural, their harmony sickening. Karanir. His voice was both hoarse and resonant, as though 2 men spoke through the same throat. "You bring me what I sought." His gaze fell on the coffer, and the crown within pulsed in answer. The song that had been soft now swelled, a rising chord that filled the chamber with vibration. The rangers drew their weapons. Yogar's spear flashed, Eogar's hand shook, but held steady. Baronar planted his stance like an unyielding wall. Yet Phamir felt their courage quiver. This was no warband leader. This was a man consumed, his agony turned to power. Karanir took 1 step forward, and the ground shuddered beneath his weight. The rings sang against one another, discordant yet unstoppable, feeding on the crown's answering call. Phamir's instincts screamed to flee, yet his feet rooted. The crown pressed against his chest like a heartbeat, louder and louder. He understood then, the crown was not waiting to be taken. It was choosing. And in that moment, it chose him. A sudden heat lanced through his body, searing yet intoxicating. Visions came, victory, order, an end to all shadows. But beneath the promise was something darker, the subtle curve of chains, the silence of freedom extinguished. Phamir gasped and tore his mind free, sweat beading on his brow. He looked at Karanir, whose cracked lips split into something like a smile. "You hear it too," the sorcerer crooned. "You know it's mercy. Give it to me, Captain, and I will spare you the torment of carrying what was never meant for your kind." Phamir lifted his blade instead. His voice rang clear, louder than he felt. "You have burned enough lives, Karanir. You will not burn this world." The chamber erupted into chaos. Steel met steel, torches crashed, the crown's song rose to a fever pitch. For the first time, Phamir felt not only fear, but the terrible weight of destiny pressing upon him. And he knew with chilling certainty, nothing would ever be the same again. The chamber had become a storm. Flame rushed across the floor where Karanir's rings clashed against one another, their power spilling like molten chains. The rangers fought at the edge of the blaze, blades flashing in the suffocating dark. Orcs lunged from shadowed arches, shrieking. Twisted men with eyes clouded white moved like puppets. Baroner's sword rose and fell with steady rhythm, his breath sharp, his face a mask of control. Yogar's spear swept arcs of silver, breaking through snarls and bone. Aegar stumbled once, fear biting at his knees, but Phamir's shout steadied him, and the boy thrust forward with surprising strength. And in the center, the crown pulsed. Phamir clutched the coffer against his chest, but the silver bands glowed now, searing his palms. The song filled him, drowning the clash of steel. It did not beg, it did not command. It offered order, peace, an end to fear. Visions pressed against his eyes, his city unbroken, his men never buried, his father's approval at last, weight lifted from his shoulders. Yet another vision lingered beneath, cities kneeling in silence, laughter absent, freedom dissolved in chains as smooth as glass. Narion's voice cut through, sharp and urgent. She had drawn her blade of pale steel, its edge gleaming like frozen starlight, holding back two of Karanir's thralls with effortless grace. "Phamir," she cried, her voice trembling with more than exertion. "The crown cannot stay silent forever. It will choose, and it will consume the unready." He staggered, gripping the coffer tighter. "Then tell me, who among us is ready for such a thing?" Her eyes locked with his, silver fire meeting mortal weariness. "No one is ready. But someone must endure it long enough to break him." Karanir's laughter rumbled across the chamber, low and terrible. His cracked skin bled fire, his rings burning brighter with each step. "Yes, Captain," he crooned. "Put it on. Feel what I feel. Let it end your weakness. Let it burn you clean." The words clawed at Phamir, pulling him toward the crown. His knees shook. He could almost believe Karanir's agony was strength. Almost. Baroner broke through the line of thralls, blood across his cheek, his voice harsh with urgency. "Phamir, decide. If you falter, we die here." Phamir's heart hammered. He looked his men, Baroner steady, Yogar snarling in defiance, young Aegar trembling but unyielding. These were not visions. These were a wave of radiance swept outward, hurling Karanir's thralls into the walls. The orcs shrieked, blinded, their bodies collapsing into dust. Even Phamir staggered back, shielding his eyes. Narion stood in the center, trembling, her voice lifting in words older than the stone around them. The crown blazed like a sun, her hair whipping around her face. Karanir recoiled, his rings screaming against the harmony. His body cracked wider, fire spilling through the fissures. For the first time, the scholar-sorcerer looked afraid. But the cost was immediate. Narion cried out, clutching her head as blood trickled from her nose. The crown magnified her essence, drawing her strength, forcing her purity into a weapon. She was not built for endurance, her light, though bright, was fragile under such strain. Phamir saw her knees buckle. He knew in an instant she would not last. "Captain!" Aegar shouted, his young voice breaking. "She'll die." The choice carved into Phamir's chest like a blade. To take the crown was to invite its torment into himself, to risk becoming what Karanir had become. To let Narion bear it meant losing her, and with her, their only shield against the rings. Baronar shouted again, fury laced with desperation. Phamir, now! Phamir's breath shook. He had faced fear before, but never this, the knowledge that to save them, he might damn himself. The crown burned before him, Narion's hands shaking beneath its weight, Karanir advancing with fire in his veins. The world narrowed to a single truth. The next choice would decide not only the battle, but the fate of all who lived beyond these walls. And so, with a cry that was equal parts rage and surrender, Phamir stepped forward, reaching for the crown. The chamber burned with more than fire. Flames licked the stone as Karanir advanced, each step sending cracks through the marble floor. The rings on his fingers blazed, one red, one silver, their light gnawing at one another like beasts trapped in the same cage. The air reeked of sulfur and old blood. Around him, the rangers fought for their lives. Baronar's blade carved a brutal rhythm, holding the line against thralls that would not bleed. Yogar drove his spear through shadows that screamed and dissolved, his jaw clenched with fury. Young Aegar stumbled but rose again, his eyes wide with terror, his grip desperate. Yet none of that noise was as loud as the sound inside Phamir's chest. The crown pulsed where it lay, freed from its coffer, its runes alive with starfire. Its song was everywhere now, pressing against his mind, filling his bones. It whispered of Gondor made whole, of sons never buried, of a future carved clean of shadow. He felt his father's hand upon his shoulder, the silent approval he had long craved. He felt the laughter of children carried on a wind that would never sour with ash. But laced beneath that promise came another vision, a city silent, every voice bound, every will bent. Peace purchased at the cost of freedom. A world without shadow because it was held in chains of light too bright to escape. Narion's cry cut through the storm. She had caught the crown and set it upon her brow, her slender frame trembling beneath its weight. Light roared outward, hurling Karanir's creatures back into the walls. For an instant she stood radiant, terrible, her voice speaking words older than memory. And then she faltered. Blood traced a thin line from her temple, her knees buckled, and the crown's brilliance flickered. Phamir, she gasped, her voice torn between command and plea. It is too much, I cannot, Karanir laughed, the sound raw, triumphant. See how even the firstborn crumble? But you, Captain, you are stronger than you know. The crown calls for you. Put it on and this ends. The words wrapped around Phamir like a snare. He wanted to believe them. Wanted to end it here, to lift the burden from his men, from Narion, from himself. For one desperate heartbeat, he imagined slipping the crown on and feeling the torment fade into power. Baronar's shout broke the vision. Captain! Choose! She's dying. His blade slammed against another thrall, sparks leaping in the gloom. Phamir's gaze darted across the chamber. Yogar's face was twisted with fury as he fought. Aegar clung to his spear like a drowning man, his eyes darting between Phamir and Narion. These were his men, his responsibility. Their courage was cracking beneath the weight of indecision. Narion's voice quivered, barely audible. If I fall, you must take it. The crown will break him, but only if one of us endures it. Her eyes met his, and in them Phamir saw no command, no expectation, only trust. Trust that he could bear what she could not. Trust that he would not turn the crown into a prison for the world. The chamber shook as Karanir lifted his hands, fire spilling through the cracks in his skin. Hurry, little captain, he snarled. Every moment you hesitate, the world burns a little more. Phamir's breath came fast, ragged. His father's voice haunted him. Stewards endure what kings cannot. The words he had once resented now struck like iron. He could not ask Narion to die for him. He could not let his men bleed while he clung to fear. But neither could he ignore the truth. If he took the crown, there might be no return. Aegar stumbled beside him, clutching his arm. Captain, please. Tell us what to do. The boy's eyes were wide, not only with fear but with desperate need. Need for direction. For certainty. For someone to carry the unbearable. Phamir's chest tightened. His heart thundered. His choice was no longer about survival. It was about what kind of world would live if he endured this fire, and whether he could bear the cost. He stepped forward, slow, deliberate, as Narion sagged beneath the crown's weight. With one trembling hand, he reached toward her. Karanir's laughter boomed. The rangers shouted his name. Narion whispered something only he could hear, "Do not let it change who you are." And Phamir closed his fingers around the crown. The moment the circlet touched his brow, the world split open. Cold metal sank into his skin like claws, and then heat surged through his skull, his chest, his veins, an unbearable torrent of starlight made flesh. Phamir staggered, choking, as if molten iron had been poured into his lungs. The crown's song roared inside him now, no longer a whisper, but a choir of voices too vast to endure. He saw everything at once. The white city rising in glory, its walls unbroken. Fields without ash, children running beneath banners that never fell. His father's hand resting on his shoulder with pride instead of weary silence. A Gondor without fear. And then, woven into that vision, chains. Invisible at first, then clear. Chains of light binding every man, every voice bent to one will. His. Peace built on silence, order built on submission. A realm too perfect to breathe. Phamir screamed. His knees buckled, the stone beneath him cracking with the force of the crown's resonance. The rangers cried his name, their voices distant as if spoken from underwater. Narion reached for him, but the light flung her back, her slender body striking the wall with a cry of pain. Karanir's laughter rang through the chamber. The sorcerer staggered closer, his skin a map of burning fissures. "Yes," he roared. "Now you see it. Now you understand. 2 rings, 1 crown, this is what it means to endure." His rings blazed, red and silver, their discord rising into harmony with the crown's song. The chamber trembled, dust cascading from the fractured ceiling. Phamir's eyes locked on Karanir, and, through the torrent of light he saw the truth, not just a monster, but a man broken by his refusal to let go. Karanir had not been chosen by the rings. He had chained himself to them, clawing for power even as they devoured him. His agony was not strength. It was surrender disguised as will. And Phamir realized, with a clarity that seared worse than fire, that the crown did not amplify power. It revealed truth. Whoever bore it was stripped bare. Karanir's truth was hunger. Narion's was light too fragile to endure. And Phamir's? The weight of stewardship. The endless burden of choosing not what he wanted, but what his people needed. The crown seared deeper, demanding choice. His muscles shook, blood streaked from his nose and ears, his vision blurred. He felt himself breaking, splintering into 1,000 shards. But at his core, beneath the pain, something held a stubborn, quiet resolve carved from years of carrying duties he never asked for. He lifted his sword. The crown blazed brighter, its light turning the steel into a shard of dawn. With a cry torn from the marrow of his bones, Phamir brought the blade down, not upon Karanir, but upon the rings themselves. Steel met metal. The sound was not a clang but a scream, a piercing wail that shook the chamber to its foundations. Sparks burst, flames recoiled, and the red ring split in 2, shards scattering like dying embers. The silver ring followed, shattering into dust that glittered before vanishing into the air. Karanir howled, his body convulsing as the power sustaining him unraveled. Fire burst from the cracks in his skin, consuming him from within. For one heartbeat his eyes met Phamir's, not with hatred, but with a terrible, hollow grief, before his body collapsed into ash. Silence fell. The thralls dissolved into smoke, the orcs shrieked and fled, the chamber stilled. Only Phamir remained upright, trembling, the crown still burning against his skull. Voices pressed against him, desperate, pleading. "Keep it. Rule. Save them forever. You're strong enough." His heart lurched. For a moment, he almost yielded. Almost let himself believe he could bear it without breaking. But Narion's last words echoed within him. "Do not let it change who you are." With the last of his strength, Phamir tore the crown from his brow. His skin smoked where the metal had seared him, his breath ragged, his vision blurred with tears of pain. He hurled the circlet onto the stones, where it lay dim and lifeless, the runes gone cold. He collapsed his knees. Baronar caught him, steady arms lifting his weight. Yogar and Aegar dragged Narion back to her feet, her pale face streaked with blood but alive. The chamber smelled of ash and silence. The battle was over. The rings were gone. Phamir lifted his eyes to the shattered crown, and for the first time he understood, victory was not triumph. Victory was surviving the fire without letting it claim you. And though the world was momentarily safe, he felt only the echo of chains that might one day sing again. The chamber lay in ruins, smoke curling through fractured stone, ash drifting like slow snow. Where Karanir had stood there was nothing but a blackened mark, a scar burned into the marble. The rangers stood among the wreckage like men pulled from drowning alive, but changed. Baronar's face was streaked with soot and blood, but his grip on Phamir's shoulder was steady. Yogar leaned on his spear, chest heaving, eyes wide with the shock of survival. Young Aegar sat slumped against a pillar, trembling, his knuckles white around the haft of his weapon. He had seen his first true battle, and though he lived, something in him had aged years in an hour. Narion rose slowly, leaning against the wall, her silver hair darkened with sweat and dust. Her eyes met Phamir's, and for a moment words failed them both. He bore burns across his brow, the raw imprint of the crown's fire, his gaze hollowed by what he had seen. Yet he was alive. Alive and burdened. The crown lay where he had cast it, dull and silent, its runes extinguished. Phamir stared at it for a long time. Even dim, it seemed to breathe, waiting. The choice of what to do with it pressed heavier on him than any sword. "We cannot keep it," Narion whispered, her voice raw. "The archives will hunger for it. Men with less restraint than you will covet it. And if Karanir found it once, another will find it again." Baronar frowned. "Then we bury it." "No," Narion said, shaking her head. "It must be hidden where memory cannot reach. The sea forgets what even stone remembers." Phamir closed his eyes. He saw the visions again, the white city whole, his father's pride, the quiet fields unbroken. All lies, all temptations. The crown had not ended with Karanir. It would wait, and one day it would sing again. Unless they gave it to silence. By dawn, they carried it from the ruins. Wrapped in Narion's cloak, bound in iron, it seemed smaller than the terror it had brought. Yet every step was heavy, as if the earth itself recoiled from their burden. They journeyed south until cliffs rose above the gray waters of Belfalas. Waves hammered the rocks below, spray rising like smoke. The sea stretched endless and cold, indifferent to crowns or kings. Phamir stood at the edge, the crown in his hands. His burns throbbed, his breath shallow, but his voice was steady. "Power like this has no master," he said quietly, more to the wind than to his men. "Only prisoners. Karanir was one. I almost was." He looked down at the crown, its dull surface catching a trace of the dawn. "Let it drown. Let the sea bury what we cannot destroy." Narion's hand touched his arm, light as snow. "You bore it longer than any mortal should. That is enough." Phamir did not answer. With one last breath, he hurled the crown into the abyss. It spun once, caught the sun's light, then vanished into the waves. The sea closed without ceremony, without promise. For a long moment none of them spoke. Only the thunder of the waves marked the passing of the crown. When at last they turned from the cliffs, the rangers were quieter than before. Aegar walked as if carrying a shadow he could not put down. Yogar muttered half-prayers in his tongue. Baronar's silence was heavier than usual, the silence of a man who has seen too much. Back in Minas Tirith, the steward listened without expression as Phamir recounted the tale. When it ended, Denethor only said, "You did what was required." No praise, no comfort. Only duty acknowledged. That night, Phamir stood on the battlements alone. The city slept below, fragile, unknowing. The stars shimmered faintly above, but to him they looked like eyes, watching, waiting. He touched the scar on his brow, still raw, still burning when the wind struck it. He thought of the crown in the deep, its song muted but not gone. He thought of the black banners he had glimpsed on the river, the new symbols of a power gathering. Karanir had been only one flame in a spreading fire. And yet, the world was still standing. For tonight, that was victory enough. Phamir whispered into the wind, words meant for no one but himself. We endure. That is all we can do. The sea roared in answer, vast and merciless. The stars gave no reply. And in the silence that followed, the captain of Gondor kept his watch, knowing the war was far from over.